This webinar today is all about exotic leaf miners. It's an update on a Hort Innovation funded research project for control, eradication and preparedness for vegetable leaf miner.
Just following on from James's talk now that we've gone over what some of the risk and potential impacts of exotic leaf miner might look like in your area, I'm going to talk about the best ways for keeping an active eye out for incursions of exotic leaf miner to ensure we can detect them early. So, as a reminder, why do we even want to be surveying for exotic leaf miner? Why do we want to detect them early? Well, as Maddie and James both discussed, these pests can cause significant impacts, particularly early in their establishment, before we've been able to adjust management plans to conserve those little parasitic wasps that Maddie told you about. So not only will early detection increase the odds of local containment and eradication if any of these pests start to spread, but specifically we're really interested because it will allow us to minimize those accidental disruptions to those little wasps and avoid those large and sudden outbreaks we've seen overseas happen. So to answer this sort of larger question as far as what can we do to improve the chances we detect these pests early, we can break this down into three main questions. How do we target our surveillance to be most effective with our time? What does the survey actually look like once we've picked an area? And will you actually know you're looking at an exotic leaf miner fly? So let's start here with targeting our surveillance. Of course, surveillance is a very time-intensive and costly thing. We don't want to say you should just be out there all the time looking everywhere. It's not practical. So what we can do is target our surveillance by knowing a little bit about the pests we're looking for. And we can think about the what, when, and where. So in this case, if we ask what should we be looking for, this is a little fly that creates damage on a leaf, and it's much more effective to be focusing on that damage rather than surveying for the fly, because that damage is long-lasting, the flies are tiny and short-lived, and unfortunately for exotic leaf miner, we don't have a good, efficient trapping system that can lure them in. So that's really where we want to focus for visual surveillance for this mining damage. As far as when we should be looking, James has actually already alluded to some of this when he presented his establishment risk predictions. And so I want to show them to you in a bit of a different light. He showed you that map of Australia where you can see activity across the year, but we can also zoom in on one location and look at how risk predictions change throughout the year. So for instance, you can see here down in Melbourne, these green areas are where Leafminers sativa is predicted to be able to grow. But red means the conditions are not suitable. In this case, it's just too cold in the winter. Whereas if you look up here in Queensland, a lot of these regions, they can grow nearly all year long. So what this means for surveillance is it's much more effective to be focusing any early detection efforts at these times of the year where growth potential is highest, because that's when you're most likely to actually see something popping up. It's also very worthwhile to consider how these higher risk periods overlap with the presence of highly preferred host crops. And while I don't have heaps of time to go into it, I'll just point out that the VLM portal, which James mentioned, has some tools to help you do so, where you can look at your region, you can look at a particular host crop. This is a picture of capsicums, and you can actually see the overlap of predicted risk in red with crop production in green, and in this case, every period of crop production for capsicums in this area overlaps with VLM risk. So you can explore that a bit more to find the best times of the year where surveillance will be most effective. As far as where you should be looking, the first answer to that's pretty easy, a high-risk crop. And so just as a reminder of the host preferences of these flies, they're very large. Here's the host preferences for Leafminers sativa again. But even within your farm, you can be more targeted with the area that you search by considering the spread pathways. And again, as James pointed out, these are really heavily human-mediated pathways expected to be the primary drivers of spread, as well as a bit of natural spread by wind. But if you translate that onto your farm, it means that you're going to most want to focus on areas that are near to transportation routes, unloading areas, anywhere where new plant material has been brought in, as those are the most likely spots that you'll get an incursion popping up. It's also worth focusing on the incoming wind side of your farm and paddocks. So that lets us narrow down to the most efficient times and locations for conducting early detection surveillance. Now that you've picked an area, what does the survey actually look like? So once you've picked your at-risk block, much like the advice for a lot of other pests, it's best to follow a formal transect line when you're surveying. In this case, it works pretty well to snake up and down crop rows. For exotic leaf miner in particular, it's always important to be focusing on paddock edges and making sure to search the broadleaf weeds that might be present at the edge of a paddock, because there are a lot of potential weed hosts for these pests. We don't actually know all the potential hosts in Australia as far as weeds. They might get here and their host range expand. And paddock edges where there's weeds could be a spot for little reservoirs to pop up because there's less chemical pressure. So then your next question might be, how long do you actually have to spend searching this transect? Which is a good question, but quite a big question actually, and not an easy one to answer. And we actually spent a good amount of time tackling this question. And it boils down to how hard is it to spot a leaf mine? If you're sitting here looking at this patch of plants, you know, how hard is it to spot all the different leaf mines hidden in there? And not only that, we want to answer this question in a farm setting because that's where we're interested in conducting early detection surveillance. But the only way to really answer this question is to measure folks as they're surveying for exotic leaf miner in the situation you're interested in a farm. But we don't have exotic leaf miners on farms yet. They're only present up here in the Torres Strait. So we were at a little bit of a roadblock as far as how to move forward with answering this question. And what we did was something called mock surveillance. And in its most simple form, it just meant faking the damage where we wanted damage to be. So this little real leaf mine up here you can see, we just did our very best to replicate it by painting leaf mines right onto leaves. So here's the first step in this mock surveillance trial, where we started on farms in Victoria, where we simulated leaf mines into spinach and broccoli crops, invited growers to come and survey, and then collected data as far as how long it took them to find leaf mines and how many leaf mines they found. And that gave us a good core data set, but that data set's no good if we don't feel confident that the fake leaf mines were as good as the real thing. So we went up to the Torres Strait, where Leafminers sativa is currently found, and we ran a validation trial where we hit our fake mines in with the real leaf miner damage, just to see if they were spotted at the same rate, which they were, which was great news for us. It meant that we had a good data set that was going to give us reliable estimations. So that meant we could move ahead to the third step, which is to use this data, do some statistical work to turn them into guidelines. And what we were finding was our surveyors were usually detecting between 10 and 30% of the hidden leaf mines, which is, you know, reasonably low. It's not easy to spot these. And I'll just note, we were always hiding a prevalence of about 1% of plants affected by leaf mines. So we were trying to make very low populations to simulate what early detection effort might need to be like. So when we did some statistical work, we found that in order to have an 80% confidence that you would spot one of those 1% of plants affected by leaf mines, you'd actually have to spend a minute per meter, which is quite a lot of time and not terribly practical, particularly when you consider you want to also cover enough area to happen to walk past a small incursion. So we did a bit more statistical work to look at the sweet spot between how slow you should be spending while looking, but the fact that you also want to cover a bit of ground. And we were finding that that sweet spot was about 10 seconds per meter. And what that is a guideline for survey effort that lets you have a level of confidence associated with your results that you would have spotted something if it was there. Again, though, the guidelines aren't really any good if we don't know they work. So our last step was to go back up to the Torres Strait and test them out. And we did that as part of a couple training workshops with biosecurity officers and rangers. And we found that it did indeed improve the odds of detection by about 3 times when these guidelines were followed. So that means we can go back to our survey guidelines and answer this seemingly innocent question with an estimate of a pace that you should follow in order to have spent the right amount of effort to have a good confidence that you would have seen something had it been there. Here's just some tips while surveying for leaf miner along this transect. Is you're scanning the upper surfaces of leaves for stippling damage or leaf mines. Whenever you see something that you think might be a leaf mine, always take a photo. In some cases, this damage can be distinguished by photo, but only to a certain extent. which is why next it's really important to always take a sample of the damage. And I will tell you more about why this is so important in a moment. But as far as collecting a sample, all it means is picking the leaves affected by the mines, putting them in a Ziploc bag, sealing them up, and keeping them somewhere out of the sun, and then immediately calling the exotic plant pest hotline. And that'll put you in touch with your local Department of Primary Industries or Agriculture, and they'll advise you where to go from there. Also really important to note that you should always record your surveillance results, even if you didn't find anything, particularly if you're using those survey guidelines, because that gives a level of confidence in what you were doing. And in the event that these pests start to spread and trade routes become interrupted and there's attempts to designate pest-free areas, all this data, if you've been collecting ahead of time, can come in really handy in those cases, particularly if you can attach a level of confidence to it by following those guidelines. So let's say you've been surveying, you found a leaf mine. Now what? Do you know if you're going to be looking at damage caused by an exotic leaf miner? Unfortunately, the answer is no. And the reason being, there are a lot of other leaf mining species, some native, some naturalized in Australia. So you can see in this picture on the right here, only this central image is an exotic leaf miner. This is Leafminers sativa here, the vegetable leaf miner. Everything else is just a native or another species that's been in Australia a long time. So right here, for instance, this is the cabbage leaf miner, which are reasonably common down here in Victoria. And most of this damage can't be reliably distinguished just by eye. So what do we do then? Always call, report to the plant pest hotline if you're not sure what you're looking at, and really importantly, always keep a sample. And what that sample allows for is if there's any fly material inside the leaf mine, so if there's a larvae or some pupae attached to the leaves or even an adult buzzing around in there, that gives us the chance to do DNA testing to confirm if this is an exotic species or just one of the already in Australia species. However, what is usually the case when we find a little hotspot of leaf mining activity is generally the mines are empty. And this actually happens quite a lot up around the incursion front of vegetable leaf miner around Seicha, is not being able to necessarily find any active flies when you find some mining damage, which is a bit of a unsatisfying conclusion if you found some leaf mines and aren't able to determine if they're an exotic pest or not. So we really wanted to work on fixing that. So let's zoom in on an empty leaf mine. And so you can see here, these are the little white holes where the larvae chewed his way out. But then there's these little black lines all through the mines. And what that is the frass that the larvae is leaving behind as it eats. There's some skin shed in here that you can't see with your eyes. But all of that stuff is a form of DNA. We call it environmental DNA. It's just trace DNA left behind in the environment. And it's a technology that's becoming really quite useful for monitoring for species that are hard to monitor. So we wanted to make a test for this for old leaf mines, but to do that we had to know how long this eDNA lasts. So we went back up to the Torres Strait for a final experiment, and we tested the lifespan of this eDNA inside an old mine, and we found it worked great. We were able to determine that these old leaf mines were created by vegetable leaf miner by screening for this trace environmental DNA. And it worked better than we expected too. We were able to identify leaves that were a month old, and we only needed 3 leaves to have a 90% confidence that we would detect that trace DNA. So that's why this sample collection step is so important when you do see anything suspicious. So just as a wrap up, as far as surveying for these exotic pests, you'll want to focus on the damage, doing visual surveillance, and knowing something about the risk seasonality in your area, the highly preferred hosts, and which areas of your farm might be most associated with human movement of pests will allow you to target where you survey and when. And if you follow those survey guidelines, this gives you the best chance of detection. And always make sure to record it, because this also gives you some good reference freedom data if you're not finding anything. And always report very early if you do find something specific. But remember, you won't necessarily know you're looking at an exotic leaf miner, so always save a sample. And if you need a refresher on any of this information, we've actually got a guide we've developed, which is available on the AUSVEG website. I think Maddie will be able to send it to attendees after this, and check out the VLM portal again to explore risk and seasonality. Thanks very much. Now that we've gone over risk and surveillance, what happens if the pest does establish and we have to move to management? And for that, Dr. Peter Ridland and Rowan Burgess will talk to us about some chemical and biological control options. Thank you very much.
Do we have good sequence data to distinguish native and exotic leaf miners?
Yeah, that's actually, I'm glad someone asked that, because that's a part of the project that we really didn't have time to talk about in this webinar. But obviously, your DNA test is only as good as the sequence data that you have available. We've been all through this project working on updating the sequence data for those 3 exotic leaf miner we've been talking about. We're developing what's called quantitative PCR tests, which is just the DNA test. I don't even myself know heaps about that side of things, but what we've had to do is source samples of these flies from all over the world, because we want to make sure the test will work on a vegetable leaf miner that came from Indonesia or that came from Hawaii. But similarly to your question, we also want to make sure that the tests are able to distinguish between those exotic flies and the native flies. And so to that end, our molecular team also has been collecting samples of some of our common native species, like the cabbage leaf miner. There's a leaf miner that's really common in South Thistle, the ones that are just most likely to get confused. And they check that the primers they create for that quantitative PCR test won't accidentally say, yes, that's exotic, to one of our native flies. And all of that sequence data we will ultimately be open source, published, available to anybody.